Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Imre Szeman, University Research Chair and Professor in Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Imre is currently a DDHUM visiting professor at the University of Glasgow, and thanks to our Glasgow colleagues who brought Imre to the UK, we made a substantial savings in our workshop's carbon footprint. Imre is well known for his work in literary and cultural criticism, with extensive writings on critical theory, globalization, literature, and films. Imre's work on energy culture has been highly influential internationally, and as I mentioned in my opening talk this morning, this workshop has been inspired by his work in the field of energy humanities, which Imre has played a major role in establishing. From his now classic 2007 article on the system failure of petrocapitalism and the oil-centered world order, Imre has critically engaged with the political and cultural dimensions of energy, modern energy, as manifested in cultural productions and future visions. His critical reflections on modern culture based on the human exploitation of hydrocarbon or petroculture have not only compelled scholars to interrogate modern energy or energy culture as the defining feature of today's society, but also to explore ways to mobilize culture to question the current energy regime and shape an alternative energy future. This inclination to practical or political action resonates well with other speakers and workshop participants today, as demonstrated in our previous sessions. Imre has written and edited a number of books, including on petrocultures, energy humanities and anthology, fueling culture, and after oil. These publications give testimony to his wide-ranging collaboration and his formative role in consolidating the humanities-based approach to energy research. As a leading figure in international networks and initiatives such as the Petroculture Group, Imre has contributed to the creation of a new research community with diverse humanities-based expertise that is crucial for not only to understand but also to address the planetary scale crisis of climate change in an imaginative and creative manner. A consistent strand in Imre's work is his engagement with the visions of the future. And today's lecture, I believe, is part of his continuing reflections on the post-oil future for global energy, society, and culture, a fitting topic to conclude our day-long discussion on culture and decarbonization. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Imre Szeman to give his talk on solarity.
Thanks very much for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I've learned a lot from hearing the discussions and presentations this morning. It's given me a very clear sense of the specificity of the issues that you face here in Northern Ireland, and it's something that I will have to continue to learn about and learn from. You can see I have lots of different devices from which I want to read. I'll try not to be too all over the place. So I want to start though with a territorial acknowledgement. I'm not in Canada, and normally that's where I would do that. I would recognize the territory of the Indigenous communities on which I'm doing my presentation, on which the university sat. But I am in the Canada room. And so while I can't speak to the specificity of the territory, I do think that it is important for me to start by recognizing that my chance to do my work, my opportunity to be a professor, is possible because of settler colonial practices that are still in the process of being addressed. So my talk today is something a little bit different than I normally do. And I must admit that to being a little bit even uncomfortable about what I'm about to present. But it's too bad for me, I'm already doing it. So I'm going to do two things. Given that the topic is desire, subjectivity, and lifestyle changes. The first is a discussion of an ongoing project, an extended collective project that is intended to deal with energy and with climate change by looking at academic practice and by trying to make interventions into typical academic practice. And this is this project. Am I already going ahead? So, I'm going ahead with this. Okay. This is this project called After Oil. So I'm going to explain to you what this is important for what comes next. Else what comes next won't make any sense. And then I'm going to share with you a little bit about the outcome of the most recent After Oil project, which is this short book here called Solarities, which was released this week formally from the University of Minnesota Press. As we've done with all of the After Oil projects, we've always tried to make them free as well. So if you go to the University of Minnesota Press, this is also available for free electronically. Okay, so without further ado, let me talk about After Oil, this project. I should also say that before anything else, this is the first book of After Oil. If you go to this website here, which is afteroil.ca, you can also download this for free as well. We have this project called After Oil School. It's, at its core, what it is a way to bring together academics, activists, always art practitioners, usually politicians, and to invite them to come physically together, to spend some days with one another, not to share writing that they've already done, but to spend that time to develop a new piece of writing, or to develop new something. The next After Oil, which is going to start this fall, will not be a piece of writing, it will be something else. So the first After Oil School was held in Edmonton in 2025, and we brought together 35 people from around the world, including several people from the UK, and they were invited to come to Edmonton. They weren't told what they're going to do. They just said, "Come here. We'll tell you what we'll get. Sorry, I'm having a dose. I am an epileptic, so I have to wait for a minute before this comes back."
You want some water?
No, it'll go away in a minute. Okay, sorry, but thanks for the offer of water. Doesn't usually happen, but I have, sometimes it happens. So we got together, and we didn't tell anybody what they were going to do. We just told them they're going to come, they're going to be fed and housed for 4 days, actually 5 days. They didn't have to read anything. I think people thought it was going to be a great opportunity. When they showed up, we said, we're going to write a book together in 4 days. This alarmed them there. The way that we put it to them is that everybody we got together spoke to the issue of oil cultures and wanting to get past it. So we don't usually get to talk to one another, we said. That included artists. It included the former head of the Liberal Party of Alberta also joined us. and we thought that it was an opportunity to kind of lay our cards on the table. Okay, so day one, everybody just talked in generalities about, different theories that they might approach. They argued with one another, and so on. So we came to the end of day one, and I said, excellent, you've been academics, so great. It's important to have these discussions. You've lost a day. You're not doing any writing. It's going to be hard for us to get to the end. After that, though, everybody worked together fantastically. We ended up with about 35,000 words at the end of it. And we also had some public events. We've always partnered with an art institution. So the first Afterwell was done with the Art Gallery of Alberta, and we also presented some of the work that we did right away at the end of the event. And then when we finished up, we produced this little book. One of the other elements of this book that we did is that we self-published it. We learned how to do that. There are reasons for doing that. One had to do with just the slowness of academic research being published at a time when we're all saying things have to happen quickly. We wanted to learn about cost. It turns out that to produce a short book like this is about $3.50 per book. Not very much. Having control over the book meant that we could make it freely available. We printed up about 2,000 copies and gave it to everybody that was involved to kind of take it wherever they wanted and to pass it out. And it seems to have gotten into the hands of a lot of people. We also made an agreement with the press to distribute it. And as long as we provide them with the books, they distribute it on our behalf, and they take a little bit extra money for the cost to cover their costs. So this was a research creation kind of project. It was trying to see what we could do together, lay our cards on the table again, how we could produce it differently, how we could get different people involved, how we might speak with a single voice. So I kind of see this as a kind of a mechanism of culture and decarbonization in the very act of producing these works. So we've since had a second After Oil, and what I'm going to be talking about today will come from the second book. This was hosted at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. And this time around, we decided to bring together 70 people, including Indigenous leaders, members of the NGO community, again, members of the art community, academics. And for whatever reason, and I blame this on my colleague Darren Barney, who had a big role in bringing this all together, we decided to only do this over 2.5 days. So twice as many people, half the time. I will say more about the success of that or not, but this is another experiment, really. Each time it's going to be slightly different. This time around, we had different working groups. So we were talking about this concept called celerity, which I'll explain in a minute. There were feminists, a group of people doing feminist celerities, somebody working on solar punk, there was Indigenous celerities group, and there was a group that was doing land planning. If you look at the bottom right there, one of the groups was just trying to figure out where exactly you can put solar panels at any given time if you take out of the picture things like private land or protected watersheds or things like this. It turns out to be far less than one might expect, and maybe even not enough in certain parts of the world. So we also made use at this event of the archives of the Canadian Centre for Architecture. They had a lot of everything from board games, old board games that were developed in relationship to the 1973 oil crisis. They had a whole series of books on hand. And you can see from these various photographs, all of us kind of working together seriously and trying to figure out exactly what we might say about this concept called celerity. And from this 2.5 days, we had two things that came out. One was this special issue SAQ called Celerity, which was individual essays by some of the people involved, and then finally this book that just came out, which in the end involved 52 of the 70 people or so that contributed to this book in writing. I should say that Darren, my colleague Darren, and one of his graduate students really played a big role in pulling it together. You can imagine all of the fragments that emerged from this, so that we wanted to make sure that even though it was a collective that wrote it, that we recognized that Darren and Aisha that they did a lot of work on making that together. I think it's important. For this particular After Oil, I wrote a kind of an essay that everybody read beforehand, which is this essay called 6 Principles on Energy and Society After Oil. It did get published separately, but it's in a Russian journal, so none of you will ever be able to find it. But in this case, we felt it was important that there be something out there as a provocation to be able to work around. So as you can see, one of the things that immediately changed was that this book is called Celerities. My initial provocation is called Celerity, and there was some important work even in that change that I think was essential. It's not something that I would have quite seen in the same way had I done it by myself. We're going to do this again, starting in October, as I mentioned. And this time around, we're going to do it with fewer people over several years. At the Banff, we're going to do it with the Banff Centre for Arts and Culture in Banff, Alberta. Part of it, we're also going to do it with this podcast series called Pretty Heady Stuff. It's a fantastic podcast that does long-form interviews with academic theorists. There's a fantastic one with Judith Butler. You can look at other ones. Hiroki is one of the people that's going to come to this, and like everybody else, I worry that he's been looking at this now and like freaking out at what's expected of him. But there's this little, I've started to develop another provocation that will go out. But one of the things Hiroki will have to do in about a day is develop a podcast, but there will be some people to train him to do it expertly and so on. So don't give away your ticket yet, it'll be interesting. So this time, fewer people, longer period, and actually we're not quite sure what the outcome will be, but we'll see. We want it to be something different than a book. We don't want to just do a website. We're not sure about the function of a film. It's something that we'll figure out along with the people that are involved, as we always have. Okay, so I did think that was important to mention, just so you can get a sense of what I'm about to read, what its origin is. Because I thought I would read this because it's deliberately speculative. Its attempt is to introduce a new discourse. It's, I'll say it now in advance, it's pretty messy at times. It's certainly messier than After Oil was. I think it's meant to be that because it's not research really quite in the way that one might expect, certainly not in the way that the papers were this morning. It's meant to try to create some new space for thinking that gets away from oil. If After Oil was a critique of petrocultures, this thing called celerity or celerities is projective. And so it's tentative, as you'll hear, it's hesitant, and I think it's important that it is. It's necessarily so. I expect everybody here is familiar with Raymond Williams' classic distinction between residual, dominant, and emergent discourses. And what might not come through, or what I never remember about this until I go back to look at that text in Marxism and Literature, is that part of what's happening in that metric or in that taxonomy is that Williams is drawing attention to the fact that emergent discourses can be too easy to name at times. That if you're looking for what is emergent, and of course he's interested in a politically emergent discourse, one that gets away from the dominant of capital or status quo society, one can quickly find what is emergent, supposedly, but one can be mistaken quite easily. One can look to something that is already actually incorporated. Okay, one can see in something emergent, like let's say renewable energies, One can think that that's opening up something, and then recognize that it's talked about all the time, even in the pages of the Financial Times. Which I checked, and it's true, yesterday it was in the Financial Times, just so you know I'm doing my homework. And indeed, when I was preparing for this lecture, I sort of knew this, but I thought I would check anyway. When I Googled celerity, there's already things called celerity. Very weird concept. Celerity for us meant this combination, this strange combination of the words solar and solidarity. And yet, here's what you already have. Let me just get this right. From a Google search. So what we have here is, we have a business management company in Lexington, Kentucky. That's in your upper left there. There's a distributor of photovoltaic systems based in Prague. There's a credit union in Yakima, Washington. And then there's also this small farm in British Columbia, which I thought, it's a farm that I run with my kids, who are all adults. I thought this was going to be a brand new name, and it was already taken. So here we go. Solar or celerity is synecdoche for all kinds of renewable energies. And we thought we would use that as a synecdoche because it would do something different than this word renewables in terms of, well, let's leave it at that. All right, so here we go. Celerity, a state, condition, or quality developed in relation to the sun or to energy derived from the sun. I'm just going to read fragments from this book, the short book. So from the first of 9 sections. Okay. Introducing celerity. Celerity is the condition we inhabit as we struggle to make worlds and build futures out of the ruins of petrocapitalism. It inspires hope, creativity, and joy, even as it carries the weight of our guilt, shame, and anger at what we, or more precisely, some of us, have been and done. It is worked into nearly everything, transforming matter into blooms and desiccations. It is existential and infinitesimal all at once. Celerity is fundamentally a relational condition. The heat, light, and gravity of the sun are also deeply intertwined with earthly life that there is no outside of celerity. As a result, the meanings attached to celerity, an emergent concept, a still emergent concept being shaped by multiple voices, will be many. Celerity offers an illuminating yet blinding array of new and ancient histories, stories, mythologies, promises, materials, and relations that are deeply ambiguous. Neither good nor bad, neither wholly positive nor negative, neither bright nor bleak. Some celerities could be revolutionary, others will not be. These qualifiers and possibilities are bound to the particular circumstances they arise from, as well as the subjective orientations of those experiencing them. They are, in other words, situated. Although the condition of celerity has always been central to earthly cycles of life and death, the current ecological crisis invites a new orientation to the sun, focused primarily on celerity as energy, or more accurately, as fuel. Seen this way, celerity is also an excessive flood of energy abundance. The sun's energy, especially in the context of solar energy and solar transitions, is often depicted in grand, overflowing terms. Think of these refrains that have become truisms in the solar imaginary. Things like, more energy falls on the world's deserts in 6 hours than the total global energy consumption in a year. Or, here's another, If we took all of the sun's energy from everywhere on the planet, in 1 hour, we would have enough energy to power the world for an entire year. Solar abundance has even turned to the moon. Some have proposed a lunar ring with electric power to be generated through a belt of solar cells surrounding the 11,000-kilometer lunar equator. Power will be then beamed to Earth from the near side of the moon, with the lunar ring existing in continuous sunlight, thereby doubling the power generated on Earth in the same 24-hour period. While claims about the quantity of energy that can be seized from the sun may be accurate, they tend still towards the consumptive. They channel the human user of energy into a web of celerity that is about capture and utility. Celerity can ebb into the domain of gluttony when there is forever more than enough. The power of the sun is made to figure as providing for human lives, as calculated through consumption. A seemingly insatiable human desire for power pairs well with celerity's plenitude. While there is enough power for all in celerity's promise, theoretically at least, it is also true that such abundance rarely gets distributed evenly. But perhaps celerity can change that. The promise of celerity's redistribution must contend not only with the temporal and spatial logics of the sun's radiation, but also with the forms of technological and infrastructural mediation required to convert solar energy into electrical energy. It also requires us to overcome decades of negative campaigning about solar energy by the many tentacled arms of the fossil fuel complex, from media to politics, who have consistently emphasized, both falsely and heinously, not only its material limits, but also preposterously claimed it as destructive to industry, environment, and even health. While celerity promises a transcendence of limits in terms of energy, the limits of space and materials on Earth remain. Celerity then requires a reckoning with our material as well as effective attachments to the present. For those of us in the overdeveloped world living lives of hyperconsumption, shame, guilt, and anger are often our first emotional responses to the climate crisis. Celerity asks for more, for much more. It demands a radical hope as well as a radical reassessment of what of the present we might wish to retain as we attempt to rescue our future. So that's just a little bit at the beginning. I'm just going to move on to the second section so you can feel for it. The turn to the sun towards embracing celerity is replete with desire and hope. Hope for a future that grasps the sun's abundance without the need for mediation. Hope for a future where civilization's reliance on the buried sun of fossil fuels is overcome. Hope for a more egalitarian and just future for human and non-human relations. Hope that we'll overcome the devastating spiral of planetary destruction, death and extinction that appear on the horizon. Hope that we can continue living as we do in the overdeveloped West by turning towards solar fuel. Hopes that cascade and multiply and are awash with both harmonies and dissonances. While the vision of a bright solar future is shared by many, delving deeper into specific solar desires reveals that there is cannot be one celerity, but rather a proliferation of plural celerities that manifest a spectrum of desires. Celerities are orientations to the energy of the sun, as I've already said. These orientations exceed human relations to the sun's rays, but also includes relationships with lands, minerals, waters, animals, and people, relationships that are mediated by and materialized in infrastructure. What will the infrastructures of celerity be? What will they be made of, and what will they make of us? One of the desires attending solar energy is that in its universal availability and infinite supply, one of those desires is that it does not require the sorts of mediation necessary for energy to become fuel. Yet this is imaginary. An orientation that approaches the sun as a source of unlimited energy, capable of saving the planet by replacing fossil fuels, necessarily implies infrastructural mediation with specific material implications. When we discuss solarity, it seems often to imply solar energy to gods. But we would rather orient ourselves to solarity as naming a way of collective being that is constant with the generous output of energy from the sun. Solarity uncovers a collective desire to share and distribute energy as a way of regulating the social order. But today, this desire cannot be disentangled from an impetus to overturn the prevailing energy order and its coextensive injustices. Petroculture is pre-mediating the way solarity unfolds. The utopian aspirations of solarity will be informed by global oil's history of social and environmental exploitation. In other words, while solarity might supplant the petrocultural regime, it is also at risk of succumbing to its slow violence and necropolitics. What seems certain is that the transition to solarity will be messy, incomplete, and unevenly distributed. For some, solar names the promise of clean energy. For others, it is also the promise of infinite energy. This is due to the sheer amount of energy produced by the sun. When we commonly speak about energy, as I said before, we're actually referring to fuel, to matter that can be made to release energy. Every form of fuel we currently use demands the production of physical infrastructures which create energy. In the process, as fuel becomes energy, it always leaves a physical trace. With solar power, we seem to believe we have found a way to cut fuel out of the picture of energy production. The dream of solar is that we can access energy as energy, finally, without fuel. Energy without mediation, energy without the need for fuel, and so without leaving any trace of its use. This is the dream of infinite energy without needing to worry about its impact, either as extraction or as emission. This, at least, is the guiding fantasy behind solar, behind renewables. No longer having fuel, but having just infinite energy without infrastructure. But of course, this can't be true. We already have a problem. Who is this we that commonly speaks about energy in this way? The pretense of the first person plural is exposed the moment energy enters the picture, always. Some, mostly men, mostly white, mostly Anglo-Euro-Christian descended, mostly rich, mostly on land that is not their own, accumulate and enjoy the benefits of fuel and the energy it generates. While others, mostly women, mostly racialized, mostly from other traditions, mostly poor, mostly indigenous and dispossessed, have themselves historically and contemporarily still been treated as fuel themselves, as a source of energy to be extracted, expended, and exhausted for the sake of somebody else's good life. Those who inhabit what Macarena Gomez-Barres calls the extractive zone have a very different relationship to energy than, quote-unquote, we do. It might be true that we have always been solar, in the sense that people everywhere have lived by harvesting the energy of the sun in one way or another, but it would be a mistake to believe that this means we have all been or will be solar in the same way, or with the same reliance and necessity. There has been and will be no solarity, only solarities, once again, and the diverse character of these solarities will be determined by their relationships, not the source of their energy. Solar thus contains a double promise, just to repeat this again: energy without fuel and an infinite amount of energy. It's an absolute beautiful fantasy, beautiful imaginary that's contained there, that is important to kind of pull apart. Solarity as a net zero condition reproduces the fantasy of using energy without environmental consequences. No fuel means no spent fuel rods to bury, no carbon dioxide to manage, no flooded valleys from hydro projects to ameliorate, no torn apart and poisoned land to recondition. In the drama called sustainability, solar plays the part of the hero that appears in the nick of time to save us from ourselves. Solar stands over the dead body of fossil fuels, sword raised, where of course to the sun, leading us forward into a future in which energy is now finally energy and fuel is left for the history books. This version of solar as an energy source immediately available, infinite in supply and negligible in costs, settles upon the sun as but the latest frontier of an extractive enterprise whose names have been slavery, colonialism, industrial capitalism, and imperialism. Among its many potentials, solarity could be the name for this new enterprise. But this seems counterintuitive. How can one possess the sun, after all? How can one own what is infinite? We do well to recall that the histories and present of extractive enterprise have always and everywhere involved projecting the possibility of property with its intended relations upon people, places, and things conceived of as previously common and infinite. This reminds us that in many places the projection of commonness that precedes appropriation has itself been an act of dispossession, and part of the ongoing legacy of the colonial, including settler and neo-colonial formations in which many of us live. What happens to property in a world awash in energy? Moreover, what happens to a world awash in yet another type of energy that has been forcibly converted into property? One possibility is that solarity might be continuous with the capitalist, masculinist, racist, colonialist, and imperialist extractive enterprise that have defined the fossil fuel era globally. Still, the energy promised by solar can't help but lead us to speculate about how else people might live once they have access to infinite clean energy. The possibilities of lives transformed by ready access to solar energy have been expressed with hope and force in relationship to geographies historically consigned to energy poverty by the colonialisms and imperialisms of the Anglo-Euro-American global north. Could solarity materialize in different ways of being in relation to one another and to the plurality of non-human others with whom our fates are entwined? Answers to this question will depend heavily upon how people approach the promise of solar power as infinite energy. Because remember, until very recently, the upper and middle classes of the wealthy capitalist countries have always already used energy as if it were infinite, worrying very little about the repercussions of the fuels they've used or the uses to which their fuels are put. What will solarity mean if a primary use of the sun as fuel is to power air conditioners that make it possible for some to withstand the sun's relentless heat? The desire for infinite and limitless energy seems in many ways too deeply intertwined with capitalist obsessions with limitless growth that have ignored the needs of the many in favor of serving the greed of the few. Can the desire for infinite energy be disentangled from these extractive and oppressive histories of unfettered growth? Or does a more solidarity-oriented solarity require a new vocabulary of imagination and desire that prioritizes subsistence and satiation over the energy ever-receding horizon of infinitude? We need then to think about solar, when we think about solar energy, we need to be alert to its ideological function, which is yet again to erase social relations, interspecies relations, material relations, and of course finitude from the picture of energy use. To say that solar promises infinite clean energy might well be to say that it allows us to continue to think of energy in the same way that many of us always already have, as I mentioned, even as the dream of energy sufficiency provides an alibi for erasing the political and economic relations that subtend how energy becomes power. I keep skipping ahead. Am I touching something here? It doesn't matter. The ideological function of solarity can be indexed from a quick internet search for solar power, which, for example, presents standard images of large-scale farms and arrays tending towards an aesthetics of gleaming futurity and industrial-scale possibility. The future is bright and upscaled in such visions. One of the most resonant recent examples is the shocking opening scene of Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049, involving a flyover of a future California where a monotonous and smoggy landscape stocked with solar panels fills the screen to project a darkly ecological mode of entropy, violence, and decay. The solar horizon, here at least, is not a sunny one. and we are immediately asked to confront our expectations of solar culture's set associations. The promise of solarity, then, is always ambivalent. I recognize that I might have been going on for a long time, so let me go here. There's a section here on storytelling, which in part of what it does is talk about the work of this indigenous digital artist, but in the section I have, just only in passing. So I think what I'm going to do is go to the last section, or excerpt from the last section, the 10th section. I was wrong before the seminar, just so we can have a discussion. So fumbling towards celerity. Celerity is neither utopian nor dystopian, neither bright nor bleak, but a mixture of these two tendencies. If we are to take celerity in its utopian aspect, it becomes a horizon against which we can measure the present and evaluate our own actions. None of us are bright solar subjects. Bright celerity is not an achieved state, but a potential horizon against which we might evaluate the present and evaluate ourselves. The only relationship to bright celerity that we are capable of is one of imperfection and insecurity against an ideal horizon. The achievement of celerity demands radical changes to infrastructure, social relations, values, and habits, to the human-made world in which we live, to the ways in which we live in it, and the relation between the two. As such, we are thrown into a position of uncertainty, attempting to act, speak, make, live, against the grain of our own experience and learned behavior. In attempting to make a different world, we are thrown into the position of inexperience. We don't know yet how to live in a bright celerity. We are not and don't know how to be bright solar subjects. There's this opposition between bleak and bright, which is developed, which you didn't get totally here, but if I have to say what I've read so far, the bleak is that sense of using the infinite energy as one has always used it in the same infinite mode of a petroculture without really thinking about fuel, but using it infinitely. So there's that promise that comes with solar potentially of infinite energy without the demands of fuel. Has a dark side to it as well. It's more of the same, in other words. Bleak, that's kind of more of the bleak celerity. We also talk about this bright celerity. Here's the thing, we don't know how to live in this bright celerity. We are not and don't know how to be bright solar subjects. The world that would produce such a subject has not yet come into being. That leaves us in a position of radical insecurity, where our knowledge is embedded in practice and habit and tradition, concretized in our infrastructures, articulated in our politics, is insufficient, improper, polluting. Celerity confronts us with the challenges of learning to live and do and think and love again, to hold ourselves askance to the world we knew, to estrange ourselves from the world we know and ourselves in order to begin to be different and build differently. A key difficulty here is the willed relinquishing of expertise. We have learned how to successfully be in the world, but this experience is unfit for celerity, and the latter will not come into being if the former is not relinquished. We are thus faced with the demand to become children again, stripped of the limiting confidence of habit. The proper attitude for the bright solar subject in the present is one of insecurity. To acknowledge that we lack expertise, that we do not know how or what to do. And yet we have to do something, and so we act insecurely. We act precisely against what we know in order to create space for new knowledge. Celerity recasts fossil-fueled adulthood as a mistake, as a foolish and dangerous mode of being, and a set of knowledges, despite its great confidence in itself, that we no longer want to support. The proper attitude of insecurity is difficult to dwell in as an adult, but we might turn to the toddler as an emblem for proper solar subjectivity in the present. To try and fail and try again with no failure of confidence, but rather a joy in the simple fact of improvement. There is no place in the present for a finished statement of celerity, only provisional and imperfect gestures and efforts and figures. This holds for any and all areas of human expertise. What might solar art look like? Solar politics, solar community, solar education. We strive to estrange the present in new practices, and what we produce from our fossil fuel circumstances is to the horizon of bright celerity as the crude but joyful scrawl of a child is to a masterpiece. Or to be more exact, within the most sophisticated and radical products of the present, we will discern at best crude traces of that alternative future. It is possible that this crudeness is also a necessary quality of celerity, a quality of imperfection, of an openness to revision. Celerity in the present is taking pride in a shitty first attempt, and the commitment of the second attempt, in contrast to the practiced motions through which flows the status quo. And I suppose what I've been talking about after oil school is precisely this as well. Not the focused, practiced motions of what academics do, but doing something we don't know. Like, well, let me stop doing sides here. Celerity is fumbling towards something we don't know and can't quite figure out. Celerity is discomfort and insecurity, because only then do we know that we're on unfamiliar ground. Solar community is shared frustration. It's the difficulty of acting together when the rules need making up as we go along, when goals and aims are unclear, when failure is encoded into the success. None of us is a bright solar subject. We are all amateurs or worse. We can only make the bright solar future with bleak present materials. The process of transition is necessarily compromised, and the foundations of a solar future, the panels themselves, are a document of a utopian future that is also a document of barbarism. The question of urgency is here prominent. The globalized fossil-fueled capitalist mode of production stands ready as a coiled spring to produce a solar future, and the brief time frame provided by the shrinking carbon budget for 2 degrees Celsius or 1.2 degrees Celsius necessitates its deployment. Even if there was the will, there's not the time for the means of producing the solar future to be made commensurate to its utopian figure. Which is to ask, can we make a bright future with bleak materials? Can solar technology produced through the exploitation of labor and nature power a utopia? The difficulty of bright celerity, as with any utopian horizon, is the difficulty of its translation into positive images, words, representation. The utopian process is one of continual failure, and not so much moving towards, but away from. This is the necessity of a confident, yet insecure subject and community, of acting in the unknown, of a leap of faith, of the negation of what is and the affirmation of what is not, of what cannot be known, but only intuited from its universal quality, that which unites rather than divides. Conditions of climate emergency and climate urgency provide a new and difficult context for utopian thought, as it demands positive and manifest action. How to act in uncertainty, yet also act positively. How to aim at utopia, but also knowingly deploy and draw upon and so propagate the productive capacities of the present in order to maintain the boundary conditions of the planet such that utopia may be possible within it. There's a lot of concern at present to imagine alternative futures, to produce radical imaginaries that critique the present and figure alternative ways of being and living. The effort to grapple with celerities is but one example of this. But there's now a concern with overproduction of futures. Too many futures created, consumed and discarded, going nowhere. The future not as colonized by the present, but negated through becoming transformed into futures as commodities. This overproduction is antagonistic to celerity. Celerity requires instead stories that take root, stories that are not statements, but essays in the sense of essay, tries, gestures that are returned to and elaborated time and again, stories that try and fail and try again, stories that we commit to and allow to change the way we live now, which in turn reveals the limitations and failures of the stories and give means to rework them. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks. So I'm reading this on behalf of the 52 people that wrote it.
Okay, we have about half an hour for questions, for discussion. Any questions?
Anything I can't answer, I'll defer it to the other 15.
Okay, right.
I was wondering, I'm not sure if I got what you're saying precisely or not, maybe not, but it seems like you're describing like that sort of duality between business as usual, continued, and like the post-growth type of trying to figure out how that would be society. I was wondering, like, even using this term solarities, like, it came across as quite confusing to me because it makes me think of, SPV, solar energy, solar, voltaic cells, silicon wafers, all that sort of thing. And is it wise to go down that route of using this type of language when I feel like maybe it's a bit like what we said earlier about once you're splitting, you're losing. Like just using the tools we have about post-growth and explaining things this way, is that not maybe a better way to go about it? I know it sounds like a big criticism, I'm not trying to say that, it's how I felt when I was listening.
Yeah.
I don't know if I got you wrong or not.
Not at all, not at all. I mean, what this is meant to do is a dialogue. It's meant to be speculative about exactly what do we do with something that might look like a future. So, and it's meant to kind of unnerve some of those, I guess, what might be self-certainties that we always do in any kind of academic work. So when we talk about, one of the things I would say back to you is, how do you know degrowth, what that is, and if that's the right way? What we know is that there's some kind of, I feel it, I think it's true, there's some kind of opening. Now what do we do around that in relationship to decarbonization, in relationship perhaps to energy transition? Where do we make sure we don't go wrong? To kind of come back to what I said about Williams, where do we make sure that it's truly emergent and not just an element of the dominant that seems emergent? How do we destabilize ourselves? How do we change the language? Celerity is it's a silly word. It's not meant as a neologism. It's meant to say, like, let's not use this phrase renewable energies. That's such a beautiful already phrase that's contained. Let's do something that's a mess. I said it so many times that like my mouth is reframed around the word celerity. But it does provide an opportunity to then think, think about things we wouldn't have otherwise. There's a big part in here about Georges Bataille's work on energy, which is really important, which is about abundance. But again, we didn't want to be people that are offering a critique of Bataille. Like, we don't want to be Bataille scholars. We want instead to think about, like, what are the pieces, if I had to summarize, and maybe this would help, it's this. There's a fantasy around solar. It's contested. Bill McKibben said, the American journalist Bill McKibben and also activist in 350.org, he greeted the election of Joe Biden. His very first thing he wrote, he says, the era of oil is over. The next things are renewable energies. I think he's right. We can have a discussion of what that means, but it means that we're now in this other terrain where whatever else is going to happen, it's not going to be on the terrain of extractive companies. However, nothing is certain about what renewable energy is going to look like. Nothing is certain about whether we can tie these energy transitions to other kinds of social transitions. So solar and celerity is kind of meant to kind of mix those together. And then it allows us to do some of that work that I hope I captured a little bit, which is understanding that we've always used energy as if it were infinite. We've always acted as if we always have had solar energy. And not just because, fossil fuels come from the sun at some point. It's more just about a disposition. It's more about expenditure. It's more about not worry about the fuel. That's the problem with fossil fuels. None of us would be here if there wasn't any fuel to fossil fuels, right? We would just burn it, who cares? It's the greenhouse gas emissions, it's the consequences that are the issue. It's the fuel part, not the energy part, that worries us. So as we kind of think through those things, then it's kind of like, well, what is this fantasy? And I do think there is a fantasy about renewables. What does it allow us to not do? What is it? Of course, we'll say, people immediately will say, yes, we need certain kinds of minerals, we need lithium, and that's fine. That's all there. But there is this sense that one of the openings somehow is now there's infinite energy in a way there wasn't before. And that infinite energy is all of a sudden distributed in a way that it wasn't, so it's to everybody. And I suppose part of this is to tarry with that possibility and also do it in a way that's very cautious. To learn about what is being negotiated, to learn about how this landscape, how this emerging terrain is like, and to also know we don't know anything about it, and to be conscious about that and to be okay about that. So that's the, at most, what I could give you in 10 pages from a book which is meant to be speculative.
So just like, sorry, I'm not like,
No, go ahead.
Is it just like a linguistic tool? Does it worse yourself from the sorts of language we're using, like renewable, sustainable, that kind of thing? It's just a way to kind of wipe the slate clean, in a sense?
A little bit. It's a conceptual tool that hopefully, and there can be others, allows one to reflect on the narrative devices that one is using, given how those are coded into existing practices. When I read renewable now, I think of all kinds of worries I have about that. So renewable doesn't say anything about property. Renewable doesn't say anything about how it's distributed. Renewable says nothing about what use is put towards. Right? All it tells me is some of what I was saying. It just tells me that maybe the fuel part is missing, and that maybe you can get a lot of energy, and it's infinite in supply, maybe if not at any given moment. So it doesn't tell me all those other things. So that when we as academics, we think about this and slap this other word together, we always have to think about that other thing. And I guess what we were saying is like, we are not going to map this concretely, even though again, we do the same thing every time at after school. Every single person has they already have a story, they have something ready. They're all type, we have 70 type A personalities representing different disciplines, all working on this subject. They're ready to bring their knowledges to bear. And some of what the work of this particular kind of academic knowledge production, and that's part of what my presentation is about. And hopefully that kind of connects back up to that sense of being a toddler in this space that I was reading at the end. It's kind of meant to destabilize accepted practice as well. So yeah, no, your comments are right on the mark. And I think there's an implied critique in your comments, and I think that's legitimate too. Yeah, I won't defend this in a sense, but I think that does the work of the defense, which sounds paradoxical, but it is. Somebody else had it?
Yes.
I guess, well, let's go back there first.
Yeah, so you mentioned just there, you mentioned a few times property, and you also mentioned this idea of abundance or infinite energy. But one thing that's often overlooked, I think, is that the space to harvest these flows isn't infinite. And in a sense, there's a really key social relation there, which is often not spoken about, which is who controls this space or the land to harvest it. And that's where I think there's sort of like a hidden property element already going on there.
Yeah.
In that these flows are already being enclosed and sort of silently, in a sense. So I think that's something that's definitely worth thinking about.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So, and that's key. So one of the things we did during the event, which if you can see in the, I don't know how much you can see, but it's in the two side bits, is that we took a region next to, it's like a mini province inside the province of Ontario next to Toronto. And we took out all of the space where you could not put solar panels. That didn't just include private property, so that included watersheds, it included areas designated for agricultural purposes. It included certain borders around cities, it included indigenous land under treaty. There are more categories than that. Once you took out indigenous, or once you took conservation areas, national parks, provincial parks, once you took all that out, there wasn't very much space. What was available was largely private. And so then what would have to happen is a negotiation with those private communities. So this is when property comes in. There's a short, actually there's little, I should show you this thing too if you want to look at this crazy thing. But there's, the very first thing is actually about there's little side things. It's about planning and property and about the process that is involved in putting this stuff up, because there certainly is, again, these are kind of things in one's imagination. My imagination, you just put it everywhere, and then you're done, right? Those phrases I was putting out there, which are from scientific journals or scientists who are arguing the case for solar. There's so much solar that shows up in 1 hour, we can run everything we need to in a year. I mean, capturing it is a problem. Where you capture it, where you can't capture it, who owns the capture? Absolutely, absolutely. There are some places where if you have your own solar powers in your property, you can sell it back to the grid. In Canada, that's been discontinued in most places. With the anticipation that that will be taken over by public utilities or kind of public-private partnership utilities, so that you won't be able to generate all your own solar power. So yeah, well, that's an excellent point. I mean, it also speaks to, I want to hear you follow up, it also speaks to strange geographies of modernity. So the places that become best to power through solar are actually really low-density suburbs. LA is a much better place to power via solar energy than New York City, just because of rooftops to people. So it's, again, it's a different kind of thing that we were doing all these days. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that this idea of solarity or this sort of conundrum with land, it also offers an opportunity or an avenue to rethink those relations. So we don't have to be stuck with these already very inequitable land relations, ownership relations. We can rethink who owns these flows, and that can open up a whole new spectrum of ways of thinking about solarity, about these resources, how they're distributed.
That's exactly right. Okay, so you're totally on board. No, but this is exactly right. So part of the reason to do that work of saying, here are common things. We want a watershed, and there are reasons why it would be bad to build there. We're not going to impede on indigenous land. There's agricultural land. There's a green belt around Toronto. Very limited supply has been pushed into by conservative governments in the past for more suburban development. So you're not left with much. So that little bit, it's not always as little as it was here. It was about 3% that was not private. So if you're going to do something, well, then you have to have a different idea about the private. Because what then will happen is there's two, in this area, I should just tell you, because it really fits well what you're saying. So there's two private landowners. One are well-off Torontonians that have weekend houses there, and actually horse farms, small horse farms. We're talking very, very wealthy. And then there are small farms. In the past, the small farms are against windmills and solar power. So are the horse farms, hobby horses. So who do you think will lose out generally? Again, the people that are poor. Well, solarity says no, you can't. We're not going to play that game. We're not going to play that game where it's a NIMBY on the part of the rich people. These agricultural communities don't necessarily want it either, but they'll just lose out. Instead, there has to be kind of a dynamic, there has to be kind of reassessment of property. So, yeah, thanks for the comments. Please.
I'm just wondering if the goal should be infinite energy, and for what purpose? Like to continue this infinite consumption and this kind of masters of the earth attitude of greed that goes into the nest in the first place. Yeah.
No, so again, that's an excellent point, and that's the thing that is nervous here, because I would say a lot of what, just say it again, a lot of what I think animates environmental movements or those who are involved in energy activism is not energy, it's the fuel. And I know that seems like a small distinction, and energy is just used in place of fuel. But if one remembers that, then what happens when you take the fuel out of the picture? Well, then supposedly we've won the day around that resource. But if the point of that is just to eliminate fuel and not to change how one relates to energy, then you're just a petroculture using a different kind of fuel. Right? So the trickiness of the slight division, the slight difference is that with fossil fuels, there was a kind of an ownership around it, which was precisely not about abundance. It was about collecting, maintaining. It wasn't all used all at once. Somebody owned it. So it won't be like that. It can't contain solar in quite the same way, what everyone says about battery size. So it's, yes, those are the kinds of questions we want to open up. If it's available to you, then what does that mean? I do think that there's this, again, I'll speak very, very broad to broad imaginaries. You can disagree with me, it's fine. There's a sense that having infinite energy without fuel suddenly produces all kinds of, necessarily produces social possibilities. I mean, it's certainly there in certain kinds of communisms, of recent articulations of communism, where everything is resolved once everybody has like a 3D printer. So you don't need to go to Walmart or whatever, and you just power it from above, and you're good. You're all good. It's not kind of a global anarchism or libertarianism, but the fuel part's done, out of their picture, so it's okay. You manage the issue. So it's kind of, again, the question is what other issues are not being described or discussed or even really thought about, and how does that implicate social relations in some kind of way? And this is done in a speculative way. Some of this in a more argumentative, analytic ways in my original piece that was handed out to people to like take apart. Now, having said that, this is still necessarily speculative. Oh, and I should say, if you were to look at the introductory essay to South Atlantic Quarterly and some of the pieces in there, I should have said this, they're far less speculative, they're academic arguments. Yeah?
The point I made is quite related to the last discussion. In a way, I'll put before you an alternative, or indeed maybe a complementary imaginary, maybe avoid some of the dangers of petrocultural norms being reproduced. And it has to do with what if the future is energy descent? What if the future is not about the abundance issue, which would then enable different social possibilities, perhaps avoid what a naive reading of what you're saying could be is like a solar plug-and-play version of biofueling the Hummer or something. So just take out the bad car and stick in solar. But what if
Ford F-150 truck.
Yeah, but what if the imaginary is deglobalization, decommodification, relocalization, all of which would necessarily require using less even solar energy. So it's the possibilities, I mean, other problems of course will arise, but if energy descent becomes the meta frame within which then whatever energy possibility you want to comes about. I thought about that figures. Is that complementary? Is it an alternative, or maybe how do you think?
So again, within, I don't typically think about it that way, only because I don't see, well, it can be part of this, of course. The whole point is to generate that kind of discussion. I don't see that as part of the kind of undergirding imaginary. I see it fundamentally focused on the fuel part. Then it'll be like other ways to live, right? We won't need that kind of energy. We can figure out other ways to live. We can have the same system, more or less, just now we've gotten rid of the fuel part, no problem. I mean, there's certainly a very powerful dominant around this. As I said, Financial Times, very excited about renewables, very excited about solar. I mean, for the time being, very excited about fossil fuels, but they know that the time has come on that, and many of the property issues are in some ways already decided, as perhaps people living in the UK know with respect to wind turbine, ownership of wind turbine technology, which is largely, about 90% of it is in Denmark. So you can make wind, but you're not going to own the technologies that go into making it. So perhaps, potentially lots of different ways of living. Does it open up the capacity for there to be multiple ways of living? My colleagues suggest that there will be solarities, and that could well be the case. I was a little bit denser when I suggested mine. Somebody had their hand up earlier.
That was me, but since
Are you sure?
thank you. Yeah.
What do you go first?
Like when I conceptualize energy justice, I feel like in the landscape of any academic literature, our food system is never talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So like when you were discussing solarities, how you talk about like the solar panels being the gateway for that, but what about plants? Like plants are at first, like solar panels, and how was what was talked about in terms of like cultural connections to harvesting of food
The chapter
and-
right down here.
and food cycles? How was that looked at when discussing this?
Oh, there's a piece in here. Let me just look what it says. No, it's I'm being only slightly jokey, but it of course was there. The question then again still is about these same kind of dynamics, right? Ownership. I suppose it was here. The thing wasn't about the panels. It was more about the imaginary that comes along with it. And so you're absolutely right. If you have solar energy, does it solve any kind of issues around crop ownership, amount of food, distribution? None of those things. So I suppose a lot of this is to unnerve some sensibilities that we felt, this group, were there around the coming into being of something past fossil fuel society, which many people talked about here as well, combined with a recognition that there's no way we have the answers about this, not even the beginning, and that perhaps, kind of going back to Williams, that any answers we might think we have are probably the wrong ones, or are probably already preconditioned. And then kind of coming back to this as a form of academic practice, it's to do that as well, right? I can't recognize myself in this. As I was reading it, I was like, I'm not sure about that. But it's not me. And that's interesting as well. I'm not doing it for, maybe I'll put it on my CV. I actually don't know. I don't know how to do that. But that's not what it's for. So some of that, when we were talking about culture and decarbonization, I thought of doing this rather strange thing. As I said, I was a little bit uncomfortable about it. Was because I do think it modeled ways of trying to produce knowledge and unnerve knowledge, and many times, it was even mentioned before the roundtable that one of the things that had come up in this section was about expert knowledge that had come up today. Citizen science was mentioned by Ben today. It was about how you make Who gets to make decisions about what constitutes knowledge? Are we having an impact by doing the kind of work that we're doing? You know, it bothers me that it'll take 3 years to write an article and for it to make its way through everything and to get out. And at the same time, I'm worrying to my friends and I ran for government last year. I'm in the Green Party shadow cabinet in Canada. And you know, on the campaign trail, I'm telling people like, you know, look at the time, it's bad. And instead I'm like, well, is that paper going to come out in 2024? Like, I don't know. You know, it's like this kind of, that kind of bizarre misfit is something we also wanted to get at. And so, and to then set aside, again, it's that kind of sense. We don't know how to do this. It's crazy. It's a crazy thing to do this. You know, like it's, here's the list of contributors, here's the list of people who wrote this.
How many people were like from non-academic agrarian backgrounds, like traditional land workers?
There were, I would say there were not traditional land workers. There were people that did permaculture farming. There were certainly indigenous farmers. I would still say that it was, it's an excellent question because I would still say it was mostly connected to...
academic.
No, there were activists, there were people that were part of the NGO community, but it was still a kind of a cluster of expertise that perhaps needed the most work on that. So like, I know there's lots of questions, but I just want to make one other point to that. So I have a small homestead, and we farm about like 3/4 of an acre. And living there is also a way to destabilize what we know. And it's not just about our incapacity to do very well in the garden, though there's that. It's that the people we live with have very different relationships to everything around them. So I had to buy a truck because living in rural Canada, you can't do anything with an electric car. You need to haul stuff around. So I bought a truck after having a lot of discussions with a lot of people, including organic farmers that spend a lot of time doing this. So they, you know, they'll do their best not to use it or anything like that. Had some people come and we had a long discussion with a neighbor about going to cut wood in our huge evergreen forest because it was already third growth, probably. It would have been lump and had been harvested so many times, and when you get to that point, it doesn't just grow nicely. Birch trees die, you gotta cut stuff out. So that was weird, to buy a chainsaw. So, I'm making too many guilty things. No, so these kinds of things were amazing to learn from people with a very different set of experiences, but also different expertise. So had they been part of this, I'm curious as to what they would say, because I would say broadly, their sensibility accords with what's being discussed here. Except when it comes to the point where university prof from the city is like, I can't believe you guys are chopping down the wood all the time. Oh my God, the trees. And they're like, your trees are gonna, your forest is gonna rot. Can't you see these ones already have to come down, you have to thin it out, that type of thing. So yeah, that would have been an amazing experience. This is really about making people uncomfortable who are academics. And I suppose these activities we did were about that. So when an archivist would come and say, take a look at these board games, there was a lot of them that came out post-73 crisis that were about solar futures. I didn't ever know about any of these. We had to try to play them, they're really boring. But yeah, they're, you know, a video game kid, I would say. But nevertheless, all of this was meant to even given there's ideas in here that I want to communicate, but I as much want to communicate these experiments that we're very seriously doing between academics and art communities, and then bringing a lot of different people into the discussion and not producing a paper and being happy with, like I'm nervous about doing this. but, because there's no citations, very few, right? And so that was weird. Please, actually, there's somebody else. Oh, yeah, please, the very back.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. And I'd like to ask a bit about, or a question about the craft of writing. Because we talked earlier with John about the politics of desire and
Yeah.
then creating desires for certain futures in other people and so on. So when you talk about desire, you talk about seduction. I found your work very seductive. It's very beautifully written, beautiful rhythm.
Thanks, I'll take all the
beautiful
credit.
metaphors and all that. So,
Yeah, thank you.
so one question is, where's your inspiration? Is beyond, I suspect, was beyond academic work. And secondly, how does it work when you get people together and they start co-writing or they write a book together? So how do you take in that kind of energy?
Yeah, so, well, thank you, that's very kind of you. I'll go back to the first after oil school because I feel like I failed in that one. So I'll explain why. So it's, this one is 4 chapters, a little more substantial. I better check because I gave 1 more chapters last time. I don't know, actually, maybe some more. And we broke the 35 of us into 4 groups. So I guess there's a conclusion and an ending. And then we left it to them to do what they wanted. It was actually thematic, so we knew we could build a book out of it. And when I would go to visit the groups, they would do it very different ways. Some were working real time on a Google Doc all together. Others had split up the tasks. Those were actually mostly political scientists, actually, and politicians. And then they kind of put it all together. I worked with the artists group, and there's a piece of art in here that was produced for the book by Ernst Logar, who's an Austrian artist. And we did a really different set of ways of working at it. I would say it was much more, it was co-evolved. It was less corporate. I don't know, it just worked really well in this kind of vein, more in this kind of vein. So then where I failed with this book is that when all the pieces came together, I would say that I was the one that put it together, and I wrote over it a little bit too much. And so much so that with the press this is distributed with, they insisted on making it like Imre and After Oil, which is infuriating to me, but it's the only way they would do it. And not that they knew I wrote it that way, but I felt like it was like unconsciously punishing me or something, because it's true, I like kind of wrote it into being. And with this one, I think Darren was the one responsible for pulling it together, Darren and Aisha. It was written much more lyrically to begin with. Because there wasn't this kind of 4 days to think it through. It's just kind of groups. You pick which group you want. You don't have to be indigenous to be in indigenous solidarities. There's always somebody there to explain things and help you with. There was a group, actually the group of Dominic Boyer, they were just making up, they liked the board game thing. They're just making up board games, that's what they did. So then, like, how do you put that in here? Hard. But it's in there more in that sort of sense that then we were not going to explain something. I would say After Oil still explains something. Whereas this is more about how do you feel, how does one try to, really still is communicating to an academic public, but how would you be able to have something so that any one of the 52 of us could have something short to present? How would it be non-driven by reference in a way that might be uncomfortable to an academic? How would it break the rules? And when we got that there, then it was much more about like a manifesto, or about being okay about being repetitive a little bit, or lyrical, or some things as I was reading it, I felt I was going back in my old mode and thinking, that's repetitive a little bit. And then as I'm talking about it now, I remember like, that's okay. But there is still a narrative. So I don't know, if you're asking me personally, well, I'll just say one other thing. So yeah, this was then stitched together by a subset of people immediately following the event. And then there was some work afterward, but it was done by many different people. So I was not at the part of it in the same way. So, so yeah, I think part of this experiment for me has been, it's gotten me interested in using academic knowledge differently and to communicate with different kinds of publics. And it does harken back to a lot of the things that have been coming up, I think, in this event today, which is that it's essential for universities to be sites of knowledge production, knowledge legitimation. It's important because there's not a lot of spaces like that exist anymore. I would say due to social media and other kinds of other forms of contemporary practice that mess around with that. There's a reason why populist nationalisms go after universities because of that. So this is a place where that kind of on the ground, also in the archive, in the library research is important. But I really feel the pressure of this kind of research than something happening with it. And I have felt for a long time that what's missing is that given the topic we're talking about, that extra work of kind of doing like, you know, we need to change. I'm always like, well, how? Where do we go with that? Who's going to make those decisions? Do we just wait for policymakers to do it? Do we, like, why do we accept this division of a policymaker and expert knowledge getting out there? Going on and on, but I was shaken. I went to MIT to give a talk, a different kind of talk. I was taken out to dinner. There's a large group of people. It was immediately following the Trump election. And the engineers in attendance, there was about 4 of the 8, they said they voted for Trump. And they said they did that because they wanted to tear it all down. They didn't believe that policy was doing anything. And I was surprised that they didn't feel they had other ways of acting, because what they thought was the limit was that their knowledge on the campus wasn't being transferred directly to policy and to action, which, you know, I would say is they totally misunderstand the political circumstances. They fetishize the idea of expert knowledge being translated immediately. They have no idea of the fact that there's these intermediate positions. And they also imagine that they're a kind of a techno elite. And so when none of that was working, they made this huge decision. Not so huge in Cambridge, Massachusetts. No, didn't really work for them on that part, but of course they voted separately for president. So it's to get away from that too. That was something that happened before this second after-oil school that made me nervous about always trusting those that I would imagine in my own community in terms of their capacity to understand what happens with knowledge. And I'll just say one other thing. So I'm in the field of communication studies, cultural studies, and communication studies. Environmental communication studies is it's a very sad field to be in. It's a sad field because most of the studies in environmental communication, unlike, I would say, other forms of academic knowledge, report failures. Communicating about the environment is a failed project. It's exceptionally hard. I wanted to talk to people that had done work here on that kind of topic. It doesn't result in what you think you want it to. People might be able to report information back to you, but they don't start to become active on climate. There are studies, I can name them galore, like people going in and resetting the efficiency settings on your appliances. And then the same set of people come back 6 weeks later, they've all been set back. You know, and everybody they ask, they're all like, we think it's the most important thing in the world to do climate change. So it wasn't even like a mix of deniers or anything. And the reason was they have families, they have big stuff is going bad. They can't afford, there's all these other measures. So the outcome, the desired outcome for me in around communications, you find a set of things that are operable. And I don't know what those are yet. I feel like, and I'm not saying anything about people here, but I feel like that's not an urgent enough question yet. So we all have amazing knowledge. Now what operates, what makes it happen? A lot of what I heard today is about that kind of sense of we need to do this, we should do this, this is a great idea, we should do this. And then to me, I'm listening and I was like, yes, how do I do that? What's the solidarity part of it? What's the celerity part of that? And I think the deferral, the given of what that is for a community like this one, the expected, the supposedly evident, is the small scale, the build from ground up, the scaling up of small scale possibilities. I mean, that's what seemed to be there. Or you jump to policy. And I'm not so convinced about either, which is not to say that they're not both exceptionally important. I just don't think that part of the narrative of like, all of us are doing little pocket things and the community's going to do great work together and then all together that'll come up to something. That at the beginning of the recent book by the founder of Extinction Rebellion, you can tell I'm a professor, I'm going on, sorry. He has this narrative that totally frustrates the hell out of me, which is he kind of has this little blurb, it's rhetoric at the beginning, but it says something like, if 10 of us stand in front of Parliament, it'll start making word. Then another 10 will come, and then it'll be hundreds, and then it'll be like hundreds of thousands, and then 200,000, and finally it'll be all done, right? And I'm just like, you lost me at the extra 10. Like, that's what I want you to tell me in your book. Not that peaceful protest is better than violent protest and things like that. So anyway, that's a bit of manifesto. Who else? All right.
Sorry.
You can talk. You can
Right.
write after that.
Yes, of course. Right, I'm afraid we need to wrap up now. Please join me in thanking Professor.